In the year 61 AD, the rolling hills of Britain witnessed one of the most brutal confrontations between two worlds. On one side stood the might of Rome, disciplined legions that had conquered half the known world. On the other, a Celtic queen whose name would echo through history as a symbol of fierce resistance. This is the story of Boudica's Revolt, a rebellion that brought the Roman Empire to its knees in Britain, only to meet its catastrophic end in a battle so savage that rivers ran red with blood. What began as a personal vendetta would escalate into a war that claimed nearly 100,000 lives in a single day. But how did a widowed queen rally an entire nation against the most powerful military force on earth? And why did her unstoppable rebellion meet such a devastating end at a place called Watling Street? The roots of this bloodbath stretch back to the political chaos that gripped Britain in the 1st century. When Emperor Claudius launched his invasion in 43 AD, he faced not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of Celtic tribes, each with their own customs, leaders, and fierce independence. The Romans, masters of divide and conquer, understood that brute force alone would never hold this island. Instead, they offered strategic alliances to key tribal leaders, allowing them to maintain their thrones as puppet kings under Roman oversight. Among these client rulers was Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe. His territory stretched across what we now call Norfolk, a land of marshes and ancient forests where Celtic warriors had trained for generations. Prasutagus was no ordinary barbarian chieftain. His people minted their own coins, traded across Europe, and maintained sophisticated political structures that rivaled anything in Gaul. The Iceni had already proven their mettle in 47 AD, when they revolted against Roman attempts to disarm them. That uprising had been crushed, but the Romans learned a valuable lesson: better to keep the Iceni as allies than enemies. For nearly 2 decades, this uneasy partnership held. Prasutagus ruled his people while acknowledging Roman supremacy. Roman merchants grew rich trading British grain and metals. Celtic nobles adopted Roman customs, built villas, and sent their children to Rome for education. On the surface, it seemed like a model of successful integration, but beneath this veneer of cooperation, tensions simmered like a volcano waiting to erupt. The explosion came with Prasutagus's death around 60 AD. The aging king, perhaps sensing the fragility of his people's position, crafted what he believed was a masterstroke of diplomacy. In his will, he left his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters and to Emperor Nero himself. This arrangement, he hoped, would protect his family while satisfying Roman demands for tribute. It was a calculated gamble by a man who understood that his people's survival depended on walking a razor's edge between independence and submission. But when the will was read, the Romans revealed their true intentions. Imperial Procurator Catus Decianus arrived with a legion of bureaucrats and tax collectors, not to honor the agreement, but to seize everything in sight. The kingdom that Prasutagus had carefully preserved was carved up like a feast among hungry wolves. Iceni nobles found themselves stripped of their lands and reduced to the status of slaves. Celtic chiefs who had served Rome faithfully for decades watched helplessly as their ancestral estates were handed over to Roman veterans. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate. Roman moneylenders, led by the philosopher Seneca, suddenly demanded immediate repayment of loans that had been used to buy tribal loyalty. Debts that had been manageable under the old system became crushing burdens designed to bankrupt the Celtic aristocracy, but the Romans weren't content with mere economic subjugation. They wanted to send a message that would echo across every tribe in Britain. That message was delivered in the most brutal way imaginable. Boudica, the widow of Prasutagus, was publicly flogged like a common criminal. The queen of a proud people, a woman who should have commanded respect even from her enemies, was stripped and beaten before her own subjects. But even this savage display wasn't enough for the Roman administrators. Her 2 daughters, princesses of royal blood, were dragged away and raped by Roman slaves. The violation was not random violence, but calculated humiliation, designed to destroy not just the royal family, but the very concept of Celtic nobility. The woman who emerged from this ordeal was transformed. Boudica had been raised in a society where women could own property, choose their husbands, and wield political power alongside men. Celtic queens like Cartimandua of the Brigantes had commanded armies and negotiated with Rome as equals. But now, faced with the complete destruction of everything she held sacred, Boudica discovered reserves of fury that would reshape the history of Britain. Ancient historians struggled to capture her presence in words. Cassius Dio described her as exceptionally tall, with fierce eyes and a harsh voice that could silence a crowd. Her most striking feature was her cascade of bright red hair that fell to her hips like a banner of war. When she spoke, men listened not just because of her royal blood, but because she radiated an authority that transcended politics. This was a woman forged by suffering into something harder than steel. The revolt began not with grand declarations or formal alliances, but with whispered conversations in sacred groves and market squares. Celtic society had networks invisible to Roman eyes, connections forged by marriage, trade, and shared religious beliefs. Boudica used these networks masterfully, sending trusted messengers to tribes that had their own grievances against Rome. The Trinovantes, whose ancestral lands around Camulodunum had been seized for Roman veterans, needed little convincing. Other tribes, watching the destruction of the Iceni, realized that their own independence hung by a thread. By the spring of 61 AD, rebellion was spreading like wildfire across southeastern Britain. But this wasn't a desperate uprising by broken people. The Celts who answered Boudica's call were warriors from cultures that had been fighting for centuries. They understood tactics, they knew the land, and they possessed a motivation that Roman gold could never buy. They were fighting not just for political freedom, but for the survival of their entire way of life. The timing of the revolt revealed Boudica's strategic brilliance. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, Rome's most experienced general in Britain, was campaigning hundreds of miles away on the island of Anglesey. His mission was to destroy the Druid strongholds that remained centers of Celtic resistance. The Druids were the keepers of Celtic culture, the teachers and judges who preserved traditions that stretched back centuries. By eliminating them, Rome hoped to cut the spiritual roots of British resistance. But while Suetonius was burning sacred groves and slaughtering priests, Boudica was assembling an army that would shake the foundations of Roman rule. The rebels gathered not in hidden camps, but openly, confident in their numbers and the righteousness of their cause. Ancient sources claim her force swelled to over 100,000 warriors, a number that may seem impossible until we consider that entire tribes were abandoning their settlements to join the uprising. These weren't just fighters. Families came too, loading their possessions into wagons and following the army like a migrating nation. Women and children accompanied the warriors, expecting to witness a glorious victory that would drive the Romans into the sea forever. The scale of the mobilization was unprecedented, transforming what might have been a local rebellion into something approaching a national liberation movement. As this Celtic tide gathered momentum, it turned its attention to the most hated symbol of Roman occupation. Camulodunum, modern Colchester, stood as the provincial capital and the heart of everything the rebels despised about Roman rule. Here was where Roman veterans had seized the best farmland, where temples to foreign gods mocked Celtic beliefs, and where the machinery of imperial taxation ground British wealth into Roman coffers. The city would burn, and with it, any hope of peaceful coexistence between the two worlds. The walls of Camulodunum had never been built for war. This was a city of Roman dreams, not Roman nightmares. Veterans who had served their 25 years in distant legions had been granted land here as their reward, comfortable estates carved from territory that had belonged to the Trinovantes for generations. These former soldiers had grown soft in retirement, more concerned with their vineyards and bathhouses than the art of war they had once mastered. When the first reports of rebellion reached the city, panic spread faster than flames through dry timber. The veterans sent desperate messages to Catus Decianus, the procurator whose greed had sparked this conflagration. His response was pathetic beyond measure. 200 lightly armed men, barely more than a security detail, marched north to defend a city that housed thousands. It was a force so inadequate that it seemed almost insulting, as if Rome believed the mere sight of their standards would send the rebels fleeing. But Boudica's army was no rabble of desperate farmers. When they appeared on the horizon, they came like a storm given human form. War chariots thundered across the fields, their wheels churning the earth into clouds of dust that darkened the sky. Behind them marched warriors painted with the blue woad that marked them as servants of death, their shields locked together in formations that had served their ancestors well against Roman steel. The defenders of Camulodunum never had a chance. The 200 men sent by Decianus were swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. The city's veterans, many now grey-haired and thick around the waist, grabbed whatever weapons they could find and tried to form a defensive line. But they faced an enemy that had been preparing for this moment through years of humiliation and rage. The assault was merciless and methodical. Celtic warriors poured through streets where Roman children played, past shops where Roman merchants had grown rich selling British goods back to their own people. They showed no mercy because none had been shown to them. Every Roman man who fell was a small payment on the debt of Boudica's suffering. Every building that burned was another symbol of occupation reduced to ash. The Temple of Claudius became the final stronghold, its thick walls offering the last hope of survival for those who could reach it. Here, in the shadow of a monument to imperial power, hundreds of Romans made their final stand. For 2 days they held out while smoke filled the air and the sounds of destruction echoed through the streets. But Celtic determination was inexhaustible. They brought fire and battering rams, turning the temple into a furnace that consumed the last remnants of Roman authority in the city. As Camulodunum burned, the news of its fall spread with terrifying speed. The 9th Legion, stationed at Lindum under Quintus Petilius Cerealis, received orders to march south immediately. These were veteran troops who had fought in Germania and Gaul, men who understood the weight of their eagle standards and the honor of Rome they carried. Cerealis pushed them hard, knowing that every hour of delay allowed the rebellion to grow stronger. But when the 9th Legion encountered Boudica's forces, they discovered that this was not the enemy they expected. The Celts didn't flee before Roman discipline as barbarians were supposed to do. Instead, they fought with a coordination and fury that shocked even experienced legionaries. The battle was brief and catastrophic. Roman formations that had conquered half the world were shattered by British spears and swords. Cerealis himself barely escaped with his life, leaving behind the scattered remnants of one of Rome's proudest legions. The destruction of the 9th Legion sent shockwaves through every Roman garrison in Britain. If veteran troops led by experienced commanders could be butchered so easily, what hope did the scattered auxiliaries and urban cohorts have? Across the province, Roman officials began fleeing south, abandoning their posts and their responsibilities in a desperate attempt to reach the safety of the Channel ports. Meanwhile, Suetonius Paulinus received the news on the blood-soaked shores of Anglesey. His campaign against the Druids had been proceeding exactly as planned. The sacred groves were burning, the priests were dead, and Celtic resistance in the west seemed broken forever. But now his victory turned to ashes in his mouth. While he had been eliminating one threat, a far greater danger had erupted behind his lines. The governor faced an impossible choice. His army was hundreds of miles from the rebellion, separated by hostile territory and difficult terrain. Every day of delay allowed Boudica to gather more followers and consolidate her victories. Yet if he moved too quickly, abandoning his baggage and supply lines, he might arrive with an army too weak to face the Celtic host that was growing stronger with each passing hour. Suetonius chose speed over caution. He loaded his most mobile troops onto ships and sailed across the treacherous waters of the Irish Sea, racing against time while behind him his heavier forces began the long march south. The journey was a nightmare of logistics and leadership, pushing men and animals beyond their normal limits while maintaining the discipline that made Roman armies supreme. As the governor struggled to reach the crisis zone, Boudica turned her attention to an even richer prize. Londinium was not yet the great city it would become, but it was already the commercial heart of Roman Britain. Here, merchants from across the empire gathered to trade in British wool, metals and slaves. The port bustled with ships carrying wealth extracted from British soil to Roman treasuries. For that no walls, no garrison strong enough to resist consumed the population like a plague. Rominated about the occupation, the city a determined assault. When news arrived of rebels, it represented everything they heard: Camulodunum's destruction and the 9th Legion's defeat. Panicked merchants frantically loaded their most valuable goods onto ships abandoning homes and businesses they had spent years building. But there weren't enough vessels for everyone who wanted to escape, and the roads south were clogged with refugees carrying whatever they could save. Suetonius reached Londinium just ahead of Boudica's army, but what he found there filled him with despair. The city was indefensible, its people were in full retreat, and his own forces were still scattered across Britain. He had fewer than 1,000 men immediately available, facing an enemy that might number in the tens of thousands. Military logic demanded a choice that would haunt his conscience forever. He ordered the evacuation of Londinium. Every Roman who could travel was to abandon the city immediately and follow his army north along Watling Street. Those who stayed behind, whether from stubbornness, injury, or simple inability to flee, would face Boudica's wrath alone. It was a decision that saved thousands of lives while condemning thousands of others to horrible deaths. The governor's column stretched for miles along the ancient road, a river of humanity flowing away from the approaching storm. Soldiers marched alongside merchants, slaves walked beside senators, and children cried for parents lost in the chaos. Behind them, smoke began to rise from the horizon as Boudica's forces reached the defenseless city. What followed was slaughter on a scale that and warriors. When shocked even Har Boudica's forces swept into Londinium, they found a city stripped of defenders but still heavy with the scent of Roman wealth. The rebels, where British craftsmen had luxury goods for foreign, moved through streets lined with workshops, been forced to create masters. They passed warehouses bulging with grain that should have fed Celtic children. Now destined for Roman tables across was systematic and ritualistic. Celtic warriors believed the empire. The killing that the souls of their enemies could serve them in the afterlife, and they intended to send plenty of spirits, ahirs, where they were sacrificed to prepare for their own arrival. Romanist to under women were dragged to makeshift altaste, the British goddess of victorialed on stakes and left as offerings. Their bodies were imperfections that Romans use a grotesque mirror of the crooked to terrorize conquered peoples. The destruction went beyond mere revenge. Every symbol of Roman civilization was targeted for elimination. Bathhouses where Romans had lounged in luxury were torn apart stone by stone. Temples to foreign gods were defiled and burned. Even the infrastructure that made Roman life comfortable became fuel for Celtic fury. Blocked, and roads were torn up to E. Aqueducts were smashed, sewers were raised any trace of the occupation. As Londinium burned behind them, the rebels turned their attention to their next target. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, represented a different kind of collaboration with Rome. This was a municipality populated largely by Britons who had embraced Roman customs, Celtic nobles who wore togas instead of warrior paint and spoke Latin in their council chambers. To Boudica's followers, these collaborators were traitors who deserved a fate worse than any Roman. The assault on Verulamium was particularly savage because it represented not just military conquest, but ideological purification. The rebels weren't just destroying enemy territory, they were cleansing their homeland of contamination. Every Briton who had adopted Roman ways was seen as infected with foreign corruption. Men who had served as magistrates were tortured before crowds that had once cheered their appointments. Women who had married Roman citizens watched their mixed-blood children murdered before their eyes. The psychological impact of these victories rippled across Britain like earthquake tremors. Tribes that had remained neutral began sending warriors to join Boudica's cause. Even communities that had benefited from Roman trade started questioning their loyalties. The rebellion was becoming something unprecedented in British history, a truly national movement that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Ancient sources claim that 80,000 Romans and Romanized Britons died in these three cities alone. While such numbers might be exaggerated, the scale of destruction was undeniably. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to ash. Massive. Graveyards filled with victims who had died, not in battle but in ritual sacrifice. Archaeological evidence suggests that both Londinium and Verulamium were completely abandoned for years after the revolt, their ruins standing as monuments to Celtic vengeance. But while Boudica celebrated her victories, Suetonius was methodically preparing his response. The governor understood that this rebellion threatened not just Roman rule in Britain but the entire imperial system. If a few Celtic tribes could destroy 3 major cities and annihilate a legion, What message would that send to restive populations in Gaul, Germania, or Hispania? The rebellion had to be crushed and inspire uprisings that coolly, or it might'd tear the empire apart. Suetonius gathered every available soldier from across Britain. The 14th Legion marched south from their base near modern Wroxeter. Detachments from the 20th Legion abandoned their construction projects to join the concentration. Auxiliary cohorts from Wales, Scotland, and the northern frontier converged along Watling Street, like tributaries feeding a mighty river. Even the 2nd Legion in the southwest received orders to march, though their commander would make a decision that would haunt him to his grave. The Roman force that assembled was professional military power distilled to its essence. These were not conscripted farmers or urban militia, but career soldiers who had trained together for years. They carried standardized equipment manufactured in imperial arsenals, wore armor tested in battles across 3 continents, and followed tactics, most refined through centuries of conquest. Importantly, they possessed something that no amount of Celtic courage could match: absolute discipline under pressure. As the two armies drew closer to their inevitable collision, the very landscape seemed to hold its breath. Suetonius had chosen his battleground with the calculating precision of a master tactician. The location was a narrow defile somewhere along Watling Street, flanked by dense forests that would funnel Boudica's massive army into a killing zone. Behind the Roman position, thick woods prevented any flanking maneuvers while protecting their rear from surprise attack. The site was perfect for Roman tactics, nightmare for Celtic, but a warfare. The Britons relied on mobility, on the thunderous charge of war chariots, and the psychological impact of massed warriors screaming their battle cries. But surrounded by trees, this narrow space, their numbers would become a liability rather than an asset. Men would stumble over each other, chariots would be useless, and their traditional advantages would evaporate like mist before the Sunday. Boudica arrived with a force that defied comprehension. Ancient historians claim she commanded 200,000 warriors, a number that would have represented nearly every fighting man in southeastern Britain. Even if we accept more conservative estimates, her army was still enormous by the standards of the time. They came not just as soldiers but as an entire people on their families, the move, bringing to witness what they believed would be the final expulsion of Roman power from their homeland. The Celtic, like a vast host, spread across the countryside festival. Wagons formed semicircles around the battlefield, creating viewing stands where women and children could watch their menfolk deliver the decisive blow against the occupiers. Druids moved through the ranks, offering blessings and prophecies of victory. Warriors painted themselves with sacred symbols and sharpened weapons that had been blessed by their ancestors' spirits. The contrast between the two armies was stark and symbolic. On one side stood the disciplined ranks of Roman legionaries, their armor glinting in the morning sun, their standards held high with pride earned through conquest. They waited in silence, conserving their energy and maintaining the formations that had proven were men who trusted in their training, their equipment, and their commanders more than in any gods themselves from Britain to Mesopotamia. These or omens. Opposite them, the Celtic warriors formed a sea of color and movement. Tartans and war paint created patterns that shifted like living art as men moved through the ranks. Long-haired chiefs in bronze armor shouted encouragement to their followers. Hornblowers scenting notes, horn echoing off the forest walls. This was in passion rather army that fought than precision with courage rather than coordination. The battle began at dawn with Boudica herself, addressing her troops from her war chariot. Ancient accounts describe her as a figure of terrible majesty, her red hair streaming like a banner as she invoked the gods of her ancestors and reminded her warriors of every humiliation they had suffered under Roman rule. Her voice carried across the field, promising that this day would see the birth of a free Britain and the death of every foreign oppressor who had dared to set foot on sacred soil. When she finished speaking, she released a hair from the folds of her cloak, a traditional form of Celtic divination. The animal bounded toward the Roman lines, and the Druids declared this a favorable omen. The goddess Andraste had spoken, they proclaimed, and she those who fought in promised victory to her name. The warriors roared their approval, beating weapons against shields in a rhythm that sounded like thunder rolling across the hills. Suetonius responded with characteristic Roman pragmatism. He rode along his battle line, reminding his soldiers of their duty and their superiority over barbarian foes. His speech was recorded by historians, and it reveals the mindset that had built the greatest empire the world had ever known. He told his men to ignore the enemy's numbers and noise, to trust in their training and their comrades, and to remember that they fought not just for Rome, but for civilization itself against the forces of chaos and savagery. The bloodbath at Watling Street stands as one of history's most decisive encounters, where Roman discipline crushed Celtic fury in a single catastrophic day. Boudica's revolt, born from personal tragedy and national humiliation, had burned across Britain like wildfire, consuming cities and legions alike. Yet when courage met calculation on that narrow battlefield, the outcome revealed an eternal truth about warfare. Numbers mean nothing without organization, passion counts for little without precision, and even the most righteous cause can shatter against the anvil of superior tactics. The queen who had shaken an empire lay dead, her dream of freedom buried beneath 80,000 Celtic corpses, while Rome's eagles soared triumphant once more.